10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The year is 1965. I want you to imagine yourself in the rural county of Holmes in Durant, Mississippi, right in the heart and the peak of the civil rights movement. You're a 23-year-old medical student who just finished his first year at the University of Chicago. You are a privileged white male. You grew up in New York City. Your father was a physician. Your grandfather was a physician. You went to boarding school. Then you go to Harvard. It's 1965 and you find yourself in the middle of nowhere in Holmes County, Mississippi. You're sitting on a church step in the dark of night holding a shotgun because right now you're helping to make sure that that church doesn't get firebombed like it did a few weeks prior. What did you get yourself involved with? Your name is Fitzhugh Seamus McManus Mullan. And you, my friend, are my hero. I am here with my podcast guru, Angel Santana from Have Faith, Let It Begin, along with cancer survivor Greer Cooper. And we're here to tell you the story of Dr. Mullan. So Dr. Mullan, who sadly passed from this earth last year, 2 years ago, was a heck of a man. As a matter of fact, his name, right? Isn't that a superhero name?
I would think so.
That's that, and he was a superhero for sure. Here is a guy who really could have done anything he wanted. He could have made tons and tons of money. He could have pretty much wrote his own ticket. But where did he find himself after his first year of medical school? As a public servant, as a healthcare worker in Mississippi, trying to figure out what it is that he wanted to do in medicine. After he completed his studies at the University of Chicago, he went on not to go to Women's and Brigham Hospital in Massachusetts, not to Yale Hospital, not to Stanford. He ends up at Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx, practicing what he called ghetto medicine. His inspiration, both as a advocate, a social advocate, a justice freedom fighter, trying to fight for the inadequate care that the segregated and oppressed and exploited people of the inner city, as well as in the rural communities, would have been enough to make any career astounding. He went on to become a professor of public health. He has a school of public health named after him at GW University in Washington. He was the assistant surgeon general. And if that isn't enough, he started what would be one of the most important movements in cancer survivorship. And that's what we're here to talk about. Today's episode of our second CROC podcast is basically defining survivorship. When I started researching and digging into how to approach this, it became very clear to me that it was very important for us to build the foundation of this podcast. Since it is a podcast in its infancy, we have the ability to basically build the foundation as solid and as stable as possible. And the first order of business is to define exactly what survivorship is. So getting back to Dr. Mullan and why I'm telling you his story is because in addition to all the greatness he did advocating for the people who needed advocacy, for the poor, for the disenfranchised, for civil rights, and basically foregoing a career of privilege and of lucrative reimbursement. He, in addition to that, in 1975, while he was working for the National Health Pursuits in New Mexico, again, with disenfranchised patients and young children, he was a pediatrician, he ended up not feeling well. And I am going to read from his Sentinel article from the New England Journal of Medicine, which happened to be published in 1985. But he basically diagnosed himself with a tumor. And his paper is so good. And I don't intend to do this very often, that is to read verbatim from an academic paper, but his view of survivorship really was the first view of survivorship that really took hold and changed the landscape. In 1975, there was no such thing as cancer survivors. There were cancer victims. And he changed that entire way of looking at survivorship. And we are indebted to him for so many different reasons. But for the sake of this podcast, which deals with cancer survivorship, of course, that's what we're going to be concentrating on. And reading from his article, which will be on our website, we'll put his reference on our website. The tumor manifested itself as a mediastinal mass that I discovered on a chest x-ray film. During a subsequent closed biopsy, my innominate vein was inadvertently punctured, requiring an emergency thoracotomy and some heroic surgery to save my life. The tumor proved to be an anaplastic primary seminoma, and I underwent treatment with radiation and chemo in the following months. After a toxic course, the tumor appeared to be arrested, and I regained strength and returned to work. A year later, intractable osteoradionecrosis of the sternum developed, necessitating a sternectomy followed by multiple-stage plastic surgical repair of the chest. After that, I recovered again, and I returned to work, a bit the worse for wear, but as it turned out, free of tumor. So this amazing man, at the age of, I would say probably he was in his 30s, probably before even 35. He was a father, he was a husband, he was a son, he was a brother, and he was working in New Mexico, taking care of the needs of the underprivileged. And he ends up with this near life-threatening cancer. And it's really that process, that experience, that changed his life and really will have changed the lives of millions of survivors. According to the SEER data, this year we should be getting close to 19 million Americans living with cancer. That's a tremendous amount of people that are dealing with this disease. And if it wasn't for Dr. Mullan and his experience, I think the view of cancer survivorship that we know now would have never actually come to be. In addition, what that passage that I just read shows is a basic, roller coaster from the minute you get diagnosed to the treatments, which themselves are tremendously toxic, sometimes life-threatening in their own sense, and then afterwards coming out the other end, again, a different person. Again, quoting from his paper, it did not occur to me while I was acutely ill or for some time afterward that the simple concepts of sickness and cure were insufficient to describe what was happening to me. As with most cancer patients, the quality of my life during this period was severely compromised, and the possibility of death was always present. I was, in fact, surviving, struggling physically and mentally with the cancer, the therapy, and the large-scale disruption of my life. Survival, however, was not one condition, but many. It was desperate days of nausea and depression. It was elation at the birth of my daughter in the midst of treatment. It was the anxiety of waiting for my monthly chest film to be taken and lying awake nights feeling for lymph nodes. It was the joy of eating Chinese food for the first time after battling radiation burns of the esophagus for 4 months. These reflections and many others are a jumble of memories of a purgatory that was touched by sickness in all its aspects, but neither death nor cure. It was survival, an absolutely predictable but ill-defined condition that all cancer patients pass through as they struggle with their illness. Now, Greer, I'm sure that hits close to home. As a cancer survivor, thankfully, hopefully, I don't recall you having any tremendously terrible side effects from therapy, but the fear, that sort of isolation, the feeling of being part of something bigger than yourself. I was hoping you might be able to share a bit of your story with us.
Well, it's interesting that you should, the things that you were saying about him sounded just like I was saying it myself. First, let me just say this. Before all of this happened to me, when I thought of the word survivor, I always thought of someone who had endured some kind of a trauma, usually like a plane crash or a fire or some kind of abduction or something. And then they emerged from it. They survived it. They emerged from it blessed with another chance to be able to breathe. The difference with a cancer survivor is that you've weathered the challenge of this devastating diagnosis, and then there's the visits to the doctor and the lab work and the paperwork, surgeries, and in some cases chemo or radiation. And when it's all done, there's this sigh of relief, but deep in the recesses of your mind, you're always wondering, could this come back? Could there be a recurrence of this? And for me, survivorship kind of means embracing as much joy in life that I can, trying not to sweat the small stuff, but also making a commitment to try to be a blessing or a gift to somebody else. And in my case, I really am very focused on trying to be encouragement and an advocate for people when it comes to healthcare.
Greer, you not only spoke those words, but you lived those words. Just for our audience, Greer was actually in charge of the CROC activity committee, and she kept a lot of people moving when they didn't really want to move. They really wanted to come and, eat food at the diner. But Greer made sure that they got a little walk in or a bike ride in or a little hike in. And, Greer was responsible for that part of the organization, and she did a great job. So her words are not just words. They're actually living, breathing examples of her commitment to encourage other survivors. But what I felt, and like I said, the reason why I was reading from this article, again, encouraging everyone to likewise see if they can get their hands on this article. It's a 3-page article and it's amazing. But one of the things that you have to remember about Dr. Mullan is that, again, in an age and at a time where you really had to earn that badge of survivorship, where you could only be considered a survivor if you survived 5 years. Mm-hmm. And even then you weren't really a survivor. You were basically just lucky. Mm-hmm. And that's really interesting because what this paper does, and, in the next podcast, we're going to get to, the fruit of his observations, was he basically broke cancer survivorship into several different, I would say, sections or parts. Okay. The first part we're going to talk about today is the acute survival aspect. The second part we're going to talk about today is going to be the actual extended survival and then the permanent survival. So we're going to break that down. But Greer, when you were going through this, after I go through each of the sections, I'd like you to comment on how it reflected in your journey. So during the acute survival phase, and he calls it the seasons of survival, which is a very nice metaphor. The first season begins with the diagnosis of the illness. It is really the medical stage and is dominated by diagnostic and therapeutic efforts to stem the tide of illness. Fear and anxiety are important and constant elements of this phase, since all but the very young and the infirm.
Well, first of all, Can I just tell you a little bit of my story? I was very, very religious about my annual GYN and mammogram, and mainly because I had a fibroadenoma in one breast, years prior. So an annual mammogram was critical to me. But I happen to be just thinking about some things. This is kind of personal, but I was wondering.
We're all friends here. This is a safe place, Greer.
Okay. I was wondering why all of my friends were experiencing a lot of menopausal activity and I wasn't. Not that I was looking for it or wanted it, but I just was wondering why, because I was 55 and I should have been, experiencing more things because everybody was getting the hot flashes. They were losing their menses, a bunch of stuff, and I wasn't getting any of that. And I just wondered if this was normal. My mother didn't remember. I asked her, I said, "Ma, when did you go through menopause?" Whatever. So something about my curiosity just made me go to my GYN. And then, mind you, this wasn't my annual visit. This was somewhere in between. And she came into the room and with her usual, ebullient self. And she's like, "Hey, how you doing? Have you been doing your monthly self-exam?" And I said, "No." And she kind of looked at me and said, because she figured I was going to say yes. But I said, "No." She said, "Well, at least you're being honest." And I said, "Well, I wouldn't even know what I was feeling for." I said, I get all of these little charts that we get that you can hang up in your shower that tell you how to do it and, whatever. And I would always get a bunch of them from the doctor's office, give them out to people even, but I would hook it in my shower because I'm going to do this, and you never do it. So, and so I was honest. Okay. But then Thanksgiving came. Shortly after that visit, Thanksgiving came. And you know how you eat your Thanksgiving dinner and sometimes you lay down, take a little nap, in between the next meal that you're going to have that same night when you're enjoying Thanksgiving. But something when I lied down that day, that visit came back to me. And when she said to me, "Well, at least you're honest." And something came to me this Thanksgiving evening and I said, "Yeah, I was honest, but how intelligent did I sound? Not very. For an otherwise intelligent person, to be so blithely saying, 'Nah, I don't do it.'" I said, "That's crazy." So I said, "Okay, then I'll do it." So I'm laying there Thanksgiving evening and I'm feeling around. Then I felt the other side and I said, "Now here, see, this is why I don't want to do this, because I'm going to think something is something, right?" And I felt something that's strange, that felt odd to me. And then I asked my husband, I said, "Does this still feel weird?" And it was just feeling like a pebble in almost near the under the armpit kind of area. He said, "Yeah, kind of." I said, "Yeah, well, it's probably nothing." I let a week or two go by and I called my doctor. And I told her what I was feeling. And she said, "You know what? It could be just an oil gland or something." She said, "Don't touch it for 2 weeks. Just leave it alone. Don't touch. And if after 2 weeks, you still feel something, I want you to come in." I said, "Okay." That's what I did. And I was dying to touch it, but I didn't. 2 weeks went by. So I feel around over there and I still feel it. So I made an appointment. I went in to see her. She examined me and then she left out and came back and said, "I just made an appointment for you to go over to Murray Hill Radiology for a visit." Now, Murray Hill Radiology, where I've had my mammograms for years. It's the kind of place that even as an established patient, if I call there today, I may not be able to see somebody for 6 weeks. But for her to come back in the office and tell me she made an appointment for me to go right then, I said, "Okay." So I went over there and they, the doctor that I usually see there, they did all the, mammograms and various things. And she usually customarily comes back to me and says, "Everything looks good. We might want to do one more film or whatever, but everything looks good. I'll see you next year." This time she came in and she said, "I want to just, we want to look at a few other things. We want to do another test." So I grabbed my little calendar book and, I wanted to see when she was going to schedule it for. And I got my pen out, still being very matter of fact, not being upset about anything. And I said, "Well, when did you want to?" And I just wanted to be able to get into my calendar book and see if I had time. And she said, "Well, we're setting up for it now." That was when I dissolved. And even as I'm talking about it now, it comes back to me because that's when I knew, oh my goodness, these people who have known me for years and who I know care about me, they're moving so fast with everything. And then she's telling me she's all set up and they're moving. I said, "Oh, dear God, something could be wrong." They did a biopsy, and she was going to call me. And the very next day, which is why I'm so surprised when things take forever, but the next day, I got a call on my cell phone, and she said, hi. And she said, what was I doing? I said, well, I'm out vacuuming my car. And she said, well, let me give you about a half hour and I'll call you when you get back home. I said, okay. And I called my husband. I said, Clarence, if she was going to tell me everything was okay, she could have told me while I was vacuuming my car out. But that's not what she did. And she waited until I got home, and bless her for doing that. And when I got home, and she told me what they had found. And I think I was stunned and a little numb, but I never, I didn't break down or anything. But this is interesting. I spoke to a friend of mine, and I said to her, I don't see how this could be. I mean, I exercise and I try to eat right and I do all these things and I get my annual mammograms. How could this be happening? And then she, I guess she could see I was a little elevated in my craziness. And you know how sometimes when that happens, the other person gets real calm. So very calmly, she said, Greer, maybe you need to kind of look into some kind of a support group or something like that. And then I got offended. And I said, support group? That's for somebody who's got a problem, because I'm thinking, drugs or alcohol or even Weight Watchers. But with her saying that maybe you need a support group. And I'm like, what are you trying to say? That's for someone who's got a problem. And I just wasn't putting myself in the framework of a person with a problem. I didn't know who I was or what I was at that time, at that moment. And it wasn't until many months later, first of all, this was all just happening. And I had many more visits of doctors and all kinds of things to go through. But when it came to actually connecting with some kind of a support group, that didn't even happen the way that maybe it would have with other people, where I looked into it and found it. I don't know. Am I saying too much, or did you want to ask me?
No, you're doing, Greer, you're doing amazing. It's, it's remarkable to me because as Angel and I sit here and we're, we listen in awe of your story, where we're sort of defining survivorship and the actual inception of the term survivorship and how it came to be in our culture. And I read a passage from a paper back from 1985, and here it is now almost 40 years later. And that experience is basically being mirrored in you. I mean, you're basically telling us the story. It's almost like a universal story of the survivor. Getting back to Dr. Mullan's paper, you basically are telling the story of the actual diagnosis and how that sort of, the way he writes it in his paper, it basically brings your mortality straight into your face, straight up. It's like, we think we're going to live forever. And then all of a sudden, in an instant, our life changes. Your life changed that day. And then, as I said, the first part is the actual active survivorship when you're actually going through treatments. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that experience, the surgery and then the radiation and all that type of stuff, how you managed that, how you did, psychologically, spiritually, socially during that process?
Well, I have to say, at first I started wondering, do I have a choice in this? How people say you should get a second opinion and you can choose to do this or not do it, because you first of all, a lot of things are coming into your head. I had one person, a family member actually, who gave me a book that kind of explains various things that happen to people physically and what is happening to them emotionally that may have caused it. So this was somebody who was saying, don't be offended, Greer, but kind of like what I may have done to bring this kind of thing in my life, kind of. It's really weird. It, for instance, some people say if your throat is sore, maybe it's because you need to speak out more or whatever. So this cancer that I had was because of something that was going on in my life, which I didn't really appreciate hearing that. My poor mom, she kind of has the impression that, well, a reflection of either like payback for something that maybe one of your parents might have done, or um, you know, something, a reflection of something that maybe that you've done, that you just a curse of some kind, basically. But one of the things that I have to be so grateful for is the kind of medical care that I had. Not everyone has a doctor that they can call who's going to have you come right in and who's going to send you to someplace and like that. A lot of people don't have that. So I was blessed to have that. And
Greer,
then,
if I have my way, that's exactly what this podcast is going to do, is going to give everyone the tools to be able to achieve that type of care that you achieved.
And also people have to sometimes be encouraged to do that. Some people are too afraid to go and see what's going on. They've given the availability of the care. So it takes a lot of hand holding. Sometimes transportation is an issue. When we talk about disparities in various communities, sometimes it's the care might not be there. Transportation might not be available, the proper insurance coverage and things like that. So people make a choice about what they can or cannot do. But as far as I was concerned, my surgery went well. It was a little disturbing because when I went back for my first visit, my doctor said, everything went well, the margins were clear, the this and that, and all this kind of stuff. And then he had to take this thing that looked like a baster to take some fluid out of whatever. That kind of freaked me out. But he said, no, you're all set. And then just meet me in my office. And I said, oh, this is great. And I said, see, this is like television. It got diagnosed. I had my surgery. Now I'm fine. And when I went into his office and he's sitting with my husband and I, then he hands me these 2 business cards. And one of them was for an oncologist. The other was for a radiation. And I'm like, well, what is this for? I thought you said everything was fine. So, yeah, but, it wasn't all finished. So there's so many more miles that I had to travel.
Yep. And that's exactly what Dr. Mullan says in his paper. Greer, tell me, how many years now are you a survivor?
Well, you were asking me, like, when do you consider yourself a survivor? For me, survivorship didn't start until everything was finished. I had my surgery. My chemo was from, I think, February to July of that year. And then my radiation was that fall. And I think I finished in that November. So it would have been 2009 of November.
So that's actually a really good point, Greer. So what, just to give the listeners, again, we're trying to build this foundation of defining survivorship. As I said, before Dr. Mullan came along, survivorship was something you had to earn. You had to survive 5 years. If you came in and you were diagnosed with stage 4 from the beginning and you weren't expected to live 5 years, you were just, again, using that word victim, you were not considered a survivor. The current definition, and again, over the next couple of weeks when we continue this very broad, important subject of building this foundation of defining survivorship, we're going to look at the different models. So the model that Dr. Mullan put forth in his coalition that we're going to talk about in the next episode is basically you are a survivor from the minute of your diagnosis until you pass of whatever. It could be from cancer, it could be of something else, you could have a cure. And you have to understand that there's been a lot of advances in medicine over the last 40 years in the sense that pretty much there's a big, I would say, shift in diagnosis to the much earlier stages. So cancer cures and cancer survivorship is a much more relevant subject than it was back in the 1970s. And that is one definition. There are other definitions in Europe that are starting to come out. And there is some research that we're going to be talking about in life. Life is a dialectic, right? So life is, there's an idea, then there's a counter idea, and then you come and you bring the two thoughts together and you make a synthesis of thought. And basically in survivorship, There are some people who resent being called survivors. They don't want to be called survivors. They actually, are not comfortable with that. And we're going to be talking about a study from the University of Texas, actually Texas A&M in the coming weeks to go over that definition or that proposal. But from your perspective, Greer, which we respect entirely, and we appreciate you sharing your journey, you come into the picture with this abnormal mammogram. You go in and have this surgery. Then you get basically rabbit punched with the thought that you have other treatments to go through. And that's when I had the privilege of getting to know you through your radiation treatments. But really, the Greer Cooper that I know and that I consider a friend is that of the cancer survivor advocate, that of someone who really came through their survivorship through the second season, which was the extended survival, according to Dr. Mullan, and through the third season, which is this permanent survival, which you're currently in. And I want to say that your example of doing for others, as Dr. Mullan did for others, when neither of you had to do that, you got through your treatments, you could have put it behind you and never thought about it again. Went in denial and actually just kind of thought of it as a bad dream, but you used it in a positive sense. You faced your mortality and you embraced your survivorship and you used it to help others. So for that, we are very grateful. Angel and I would love to have you back, perhaps in the near future. I would love to talk to you about health disparities. I don't want to sound gauche or insensitive, but I want to say that I believe that Dr. Mullan's push to represent the unrepresented or the disenfranchised doesn't just happen in the rural South. It could happen in the Northeast, and people of color, individuals, men, African-American males with prostate cancer do worse. African-American females with breast cancer get diagnosed at a later stage. I'd love to have you on as a representative of that issue that we have to deal with, and we will get to that in due time. But for now, speaking on behalf of the podcast, I can't give you enough thanks for sharing this story. And again, we would like to have you back on. Angel, any comments from your end?
I just find that your story is very motivating and uplifting. I think that, anytime when you are someone like myself who have never had dealt with somebody in my family with cancer, just hearing the way you detail every single aspect of your journey and how you put it as the way it sounds, it's a journey, really puts me into a better perspective as to how we should really think about other people that are going through this, what I call on my show, storms, and to be able to sit back and say, you know what? Yeah, the word support group came up right in that conversation, but reality is we are the support. And when a person's battling that storm, we need to understand that we are the individuals that need to be listening so that we can be that person that can hold you and say, we're going to do this together. So I commend you on your story. I commend you on being very personable and being honest and not holding back, because I think that's one thing that as we talked about, you and I, Tom, is that this is what's lacking in the industry of podcasting too, is that people don't want to share full.
Greer, believe me when I tell you your personal words. I'm sure, as Dr. Mullan mentions his paper, you go through periods of elation, periods of being shameful, being bashful. You are as I said from the beginning, a brave, classy woman, and you are elegant and you are articulate, and you will touch somebody. I promise. Somebody out there who will listen to this podcast will get a great deal of assistance from your very, very honest portrayal of your process. And again, you will not be a stranger to this podcast. Angel, we will have Greer back again and again. So Greer, we're going to let you go, and we're going to move on to our gratitude shout outs. And
I would love to leave you with your last thoughts.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
I do have one. First of all, I want to say that it's been my pleasure to be a part of this conversation. But there is one thing that I want to add. There was a breast cancer event that we went to. And my husband always comes with me and sometimes a friend. And they were giving out T-shirts. And someone said, well, so what size T-shirt do you need? And I told them, and then they said, what about your husband? I said, no, he's not a survivor. And they said, yes, he is.
Yeah, he is.
That's something that we need to realize too, that the family and friends who support a survivor and who help that survivor to thrive are also survivors, and very, very integral and important to the whole process.
Wow. That's absolutely true. And it's also stated in that paper of Dr. Mullan's, where really the survivor is everyone. It's the patient as well as the family and friends and neighbors. Anyone who has been touched or affected is considered a survivor.
God bless you both for this work that you're doing.
Namaste, my friend.
Okay, bye-bye.
As you can see, my friends, survivorship is a very complex subject. Defining survivorship is a very complex subject in itself that requires a great deal of effort for us to get through. Today, we spoke about the Sentinel event in survivorship, the paper by Mullan, the life of Dr. Mullan. We heard from Greer Cooper about her experience during the first phase of cancer survivorship, and we will hear from her again regarding the future phases, or as he mentions, the seasons of survivorship. We end this podcast, as we will end every podcast, on the CROC website here, or on the CROC podcast, and that would be with our shout outs. We are grateful for Angel Santana, the greatest producer in the universe. Have Faith, Let It Begin. Please listen to his podcast. Rod Friedman from Small Biz Up. If you happen to have a small business and you need his assistance, he is the guy to go to. Special shout out to two people whose support is singularly responsible for the launching of this podcast. Charlotte Larson.net, who's a producer in Hollywood, who's done some great work, and a good boy, a local boy done good, MichaelJohnBenzaia.com, Benzaia, who's making mountains move in Hollywood. Thank you for your support, and let's keep this podcast going. Next week, Defining Survivorship Part 2.